Hello, and welcome to this episode of Discovering Truth at the Movies. Hello, my name is David Lance, and I'm so glad to have you here today. Today, in this episode, I will continue the story of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar. The four grandsons come to Grandpa and Nine-Eye's house to visit. Isaac tells Grandpa that another student at school took his Bible away. He asked Grandpa to answer a question. What does separation between church and state mean? So, in this particular series, I am looking through a book that I'm writing called The Chronicles of Belteshazzar, which is the story of Daniel. It's sort of like the idea behind the movie, the idea of The Princess Bride, where Grandpa reads a story to his grandchildren. Now, I'm envisioning this being applicable to kids in the ages of between, say, 9 and 15 years of age, roughly fourth grade through ninth grade. And so this is something that I hope that you'll find of value for your kids or even grandkids. I'd encourage you to consider joining me as I read one chapter at a time every other Thursday. And I'll include a question for reflection at the end of each reading of the chapters. I'm also going to post these episodes on my podcast, Discovering Truth at the Movies. And also, one of the things that you can do is you can go to a website that I put out there. It's on MailChimp. If you want to look at it, you can pause this and then copy it and put it in there. I hope to eventually publish this as a real book. And so without further ado, I want to get to reading the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, Chapter 2. Isaac, Matthew, Josiah, and Gabriel's parents drove away. Their grandmother, Lance, stood behind them as they waved goodbye. However, they didn't call her grandmother Lance, no, or even Grandma. No, she had a special name, Nine-Eye. Nine-Eye is the Chinese name for the grandmother who is on the father's mother's side. Nine-Eye was their daddy's mom, and she was Chinese. She was very smart, very funny, very organized, and always had something fun planned for her grandchildren. Your grandfather and I have really been looking forward to having you boys spend the weekend with us, said Nine-Nine as the car drove out of sight. The boys looked up to her. Isaac scrambled, scratched his head, and looking at Nine-Eye with a frown on his face, said, Auntie Dr. Sarah said I should ask Grandpa about how, when the prophet Daniel was alive, they passed a law that said that he shouldn't pray to God. Yes, Aunt Sarah told me about that. We've made some special plans for Grandpa to tell you a story tonight to explain that. But first, I have a question. What, Nine-Eye? Asked Matthew. Does anybody want pizza for dinner? Isaac, Matthew, and Josiah screamed, Yes, yes. While his other brothers were screaming for pizza, Gabriel raised his hand. Quiet, boys. Gabriel has a question. After his older brothers quieted down, Nine-Eye asked, Now, what's your question, Gabriel? Nine-Eye, may we please have ice cream for dessert? Nine-Eye beamed a smile. Why, yes, Gabriel, you may. And right after she said that, Nine-Eye looked up and pointed at a car driving up to the house. Look, boys, there's Grandpa. He's got the pizza. Let's go inside, wash our hands, and get ready to eat. Dinner was spent with the three, with the boys, telling their grandparents about everything that they'd done since the last time they'd gotten together. As Nine-Eye served everyone ice cream, Isaac told his grandparents about how the girl at school had taken his Bible and yelled that reading it at school was against separation of church and state. After telling Grandpa about that and what had happened, he asked his question, What does that mean? Separation of church and state? That's a great question, replied Grandpa. Now, you know I'm a college professor. That's what I do for a living, right? Yes, Grandpa. That's why I figured you'd be able to tell me what it means. Good. Now, what you should know is that I have two ways of explaining things. One way is asking questions. The other is telling stories. Right now, I want to answer your question by asking you some questions. Then later this evening, I want to tell you and your brothers a story. Grandpa looked into his oldest grandson's open eyes and spooned his last bite of ice cream into his mouth and added, "Deal, Isaac?" "Deal, Grandpa." "Okay, Isaac, here's the first question. Do you remember the story of Daniel in the lion's den?" "Yes, we were just talking about that with Auntie Dr. Sarah a few days ago." "Well, isn't that something?" said Grandpa. "So you know that there were people in Babylon who hated the prophet Daniel so much that they decided to trap him because of his religion." "Yes, they knew he prayed regularly to God, so they passed a law that made it a crime to pray to anyone but King Nebuchadnezzar for a whole month. But Daniel went ahead and prayed to God anyway, so they arrested him and had him thrown into the lion's den." Grandpa smiled at his eldest grandson. "Very good. Now, when the United States became a country, there was a lot of discussion about what laws the government could and could not make. A really important topic had to do with religion. And so there were a set of 10 changes made to the Constitution that we call the Bill of Rights. The first of those 10 changes, we call them the 10 Amendments, said that Congress may not pass any laws that restrict our freedom of religion. And that brings me to where I want to answer your question about separation of church and state. Now, do you know who Thomas Jefferson was? Well, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he was the third president of the United States. Very good, Isaac. Now, here's where things get a little complicated. There was a group of Christians in the state of Connecticut. They were called the Danbury Baptist Association, and they wrote a letter to President Jefferson. They reminded him that in the Declaration of Independence that he wrote back at the start of the Revolutionary War, it says that God, not man, gives all people their rights. Among those rights is the right to worship God and practice our religion as God leads us to do. The Danbury Baptist Connecticut folks believed that since God gave them the right to worship Him, they wanted to know how the government could then give them the same right again. And if the government believed it could grant the freedom of religion to Americans, couldn't politicians in the future change the Constitution to say that freedom of religion was no longer allowed? It took a moment for Isaac to digest what Grandpa had just said. But then his eyes grew wide and he said, "Wow, Grandpa, you mean the people could someday come along and say that praying to God was against the law?" "Exactly, Isaac," said Grandpa as he sat down beside his grandson. It was just the two of them now, as Nai had taken the other boys to another part of the house. And so President Jefferson wrote the Danbury Baptists a reply letter and said that the First Amendment was intended to act as a wall of separation between church and state. He meant it as a one-way wall that would keep government from ever taking away people's rights to worship God as they wished. But I don't think that that's what Mary meant when she grabbed the Bible out of my hands, Grandpa. "Yes, you're right, Isaac," replied Grandpa. "You see, there came a time when some people wanted to get God out of the schools. They wanted to get people to stop believing in God. Now, believing in Jesus, even. And so they did exactly what the Danbury Baptists had been afraid of. Starting in the 1940s, the Supreme Court started to use Jefferson's comment about a wall of separation between church and state to rule that government needed to be protected from the churches. And so, what does that mean about people like Mary doing what she did?" asked Isaac. "You know, Isaac, adults can sometimes act very strangely. About 100 years ago, some very influential people started to change the way school children were taught about all of this. And so today, many people think that you can't have a Bible in places like a school or even say a prayer. Mary didn't know any better. She'd just been taught something that wasn't right, and she believes it." Any Dr. Sarah said that sort of thing happened to the prophet Daniel, said Isaac. Is that right? Yes, it is. And that leads me to my favorite way of teaching, telling stories, answered Grandpa. Just then, Nine walked into the kitchen. Isaac, your brothers have finished their baths. Why don't you go take yours now? Then Grandpa will tell all of you the story of the prophet Daniel. Okay? Can we eat popcorn while he tells us the story? Of course. I'll make some popcorn when you're finished with your bath, replied Nine. Now, off you go. Isaac got up to go take his bath while Grandpa cleaned up the dishes and put them in the dishwasher. And so I want to share a personal reflection now, if I may, about this. The story of Isaac having his Bible taken away from him really happened, but it didn't happen to him. It happened to me when I was in eighth grade. You see, I had a Gideon's Bible that was actually handed out in fifth grade, so I'd had it for a few years. And a girl came along. Her name wasn't Mary, but I've changed the names to protect the innocent. She took it from me, and as I chased her, she threw it into the bushes and she cried out, "Separation of church and state." And so, other than those circumstances, the story that I share in this particular chapter are actually what happened. Over the years, that experience has motivated me to be interested in this topic. When my kids were little, about the ages 3 to 6 or 7, we would act out Bible stories. One of those stories was Daniel in the lion's den. And trust me, each of my children wanted to be the main character in each of those stories. And so we would talk about that and about how even when if the government should ever say it's against the law to pray, we should do what Daniel did and pray. And when my daughter, Sarah, was a junior in high school, we were sitting down one day at the kitchen table and she pulled out a dollar bill and she asked me this question. She said, "Dad, it says on our money, in God we trust. So why don't we?" In other words, my daughter, as a junior in high school, had figured out that we as a country actually really don't trust God as our money says that we do. Well, that's a long and complicated answer. In 2017, I wrote a book which I dedicated as an attempt to answer her question. It's called The Unraveling of We the People. You can find out more about that if you go to theunraveling.us. And so, what I want to mention, however, is that in recent years, my daughter passed away. My daughter Sarah passed away from breast cancer in January of 2016. But she had some great friends, a family by the name of O'Neills. Now, the O'Neills have 7 children. Their fifth child, a little girl who will actually turn 5 later this year in 2021, is named after my daughter, Sarah Michelle. And so, one of the things that I've been doing is I've been presenting these chapters that I'm actually reading to you to my oldest granddaughter, Nadia. And she responded recently and she said that she's been reading it and she enjoys reading it. She learns stuff. She knows that what I'm talking about in the novel is fiction, but it really does relate to historical facts. And she was even interested in this chapter that had to do with civics. And so I traded emails with her, and I found a video out there on the internet that talked about this particular thing with regard to the letter from the Danbury Baptist Connecticut Association to President Jefferson. The 9-minute video that I found was actually created by a man from Iran. What he does is he reads the letters between the Danbury Baptists and Thomas Jefferson. Now, part of the letters he reads, he translates into Farsi, which is the dominant language there in Iran. But what I found intriguing was he's taking this stuff from 200 years ago to read to Iranians about the freedom of religious belief. And so he also has videos explaining the Federalist Papers, and he does that all in Farsi. Now, in the book of Daniel, the other members of the Babylonian government hated Daniel so much that they decided to trap him in his religious faith. And they created this law that said for 30 days, nobody could pray to anybody except for Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, That was something that the Danbury Baptist, Connecticut folks would have had in mind when they wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And so, as I think about those things, it reminds me of a movie that was made a few years ago called God's Not Dead 2. You see, in the movie, um, there's a high school teacher by the name of Grace Wesley. Her name is Melissa Joan Hart, and she's leading a discussion about civil rights. And when they're doing that, a student asks a question comparing the teachings of Jesus to Martin Luther King Jr. By the way, did you know that Martin Luther King Sr. went to a conference in Berlin, Germany in 1934 about the Reformation? He was so enthralled about the teachings of Martin Luther from the 1500s that he changed his name from Michael King Sr. to Martin Luther King Sr. And he also changed his son's name from Michael King Jr. to Martin Luther King Jr. You can read more about that, but I find that a fascinating connection between the King family's belief in Jesus Christ and the meaning of the Reformation and today's things about all sorts of stuff regarding civil rights. At any rate, thinking about these various things, Grace in the movie God's Not Dead 2 answers her students' questions. But another student is recording what's going on. She shares that, and they file a lawsuit against Grace, who then has to stand trial for her belief in Jesus Christ. And in the movie, there is this interaction between her and the young lawyer that has been appointed to serve as her defendant, a guy by the name of Tom Endler, played by Jesse Metcalf, that goes like this. As he says to Grace, "You understand they will crush you to prove once and for all that God is dead." And Grace replies, "I'd rather stand with God and be judged by the world than to stand with the world and be judged by God." And so here's a question for reflection. How do you think Daniel was able to become an important official in a pagan country like Babylon, but still worship and honor God, even though many people hated him for doing so? Well, as we think about that particular question, I want to just mention that you can subscribe to other future podcasts here and so forth when I go Facebook Live. If you go to the website that's there on your screen, you'll also end up getting my monthly newsletter, Conversations with the Culture. It's absolutely free. What I do is I take movies and I talk about the Bible and things that are on my mind as to what's going on in the culture. Also, I've got a publication I call Discovering Godly Leadership at the Movies that I'll provide you when you sign up for all of this free of charge. And also, I want to encourage you to go to my podcast at davidlance.podomatic.com. And eventually, I'll post this particular episode there on the podcast. Well, until next time, thanks so much and God bless.